cutie? I'm back. And today we have another episode of Beauty and the Bibliophile. If you're new here, welcome to my channel and welcome to the Cute Life. I'm your cult leader, Leah. If you're not new here, thank you for returning for another cult meeting. As often as I can, I do a series called Beauty and the Bibliophile, where I do my makeup and I tell you about the latest book that I've read. If you don't know what a bibliophile is, it is a lover and collector of books. Right here. Today's book is A Whole New World, Another Twisted Tale. Now this is the twisted tale of Aladdin and what would happen if Aladdin never got the lamp. I mean, that's the whole story, right? And as you can tell by my princess crown, we've got a lot of Jasmine in this story. But, spoiler alerts, if you are thinking about reading this book and you don't want to know anything about it, don't watch this video. If you're thinking about reading the book or you don't want to read the book and you just want to hear a summary of it, then keep watching. Also, I'm going to assume that you've seen the movie Aladdin, the animated one, the real one. If you haven't, I would highly suggest that you watch that first before watching this video or reading this book, because I'm going to be speaking to you as if you've seen the movie, and if you haven't, you're going to be lost. So go do that first, then come back. Okay, so if you are ready to hear a summary of A Whole New World, A Twisted Tale of Aladdin and Jasmine, and watch me do my makeup at the same time, well then stay tuned. Okay, I have the worst cramps today. And I'm super low energy, so. But really wanted to tell you this story because it's so cute. So, A Whole New World by Liz Fradswell. And this book came out in 2015. And this story starts one day in Agrabah. Aladdin and a couple of his friends, they get caught stealing some dates from a local vendor. And the vendor takes Aladdin and his two friends, Duin and Morgiana, to Aladdin's mother. He kind of knows these kids, he knows their families, he knows that the other two kids don't have the best parental figures around them, so he takes all of them to Aladdin's mother, who's kind of the only one that has any discipline regimens. Anyway, but when he takes them there, he sees like how poor they are and he kind of like takes pity on them. I don't like this side. Now, after Aladdin's friends left, Aladdin got a lecture from his mother. She said, you know, don't let life's unfairness decide who you're gonna be. Don't let the fact that you're poor decide who you're gonna be. You get to decide that. Are you gonna be a hero that helps the weak and the powerless? Are you going to be a thief? Are you going to be a beggar or worse? It's not up to anybody but you, and it's not up to your surroundings either. And then she says to herself, she's like, you know, maybe it's just those friends you're running around with. Like, maybe you need like a real friend or like a pet or something. Now, years later, it was just Aladdin and Abu. Abu, his little pet monkey, had been a last gift from Aladdin's mother. You know, she thought it was going to tame him a little bit, maybe give him some responsibility, but it didn't. Instead of him running around the market and stealing and doing all these things alone, it was now the two of them doing it together. In fact, they had just stolen a loaf of bread, and the market guards were after them. One of the guards yelled, "Thief!" And the guard's like, "I'll have your hands for a trophy, street rat." And Aladdin's thinking like, all of this over a loaf of bread. The guards continued to chase him around the marketplace, but Aladdin and Abu, they were able to stay one step ahead of him. But finally, he and Abu were able to duck down an alleyway, and they broke the bread in half and they started to eat. But then Aladdin heard something hit the pavement nearby, and he looks over, and there's two of the scrawniest little kids he'd ever seen, and they're digging through the garbage looking for something to eat. And when they noticed Aladdin noticed them, they got kind of scared. Aladdin, you know, he could sympathize. He knew what it was like being afraid of anyone who was bigger or older or just healthier than you might steal whatever you had or hurt you. So he walked up to them very cautiously and he was like, "It's okay." And he like offered his half of his breakfast to them. As he's, you know, giving them the bread, he's feeling like this lump in his throat. It's like a little bit of anger. Like, this is how he had grown up too. And nothing had changed since he was a kid. The Sultan still lived in his grand, beautiful palace, playing with his toys, while everyone else starved in the streets. Later, while he was in the middle of stealing his dinner, he noticed a girl walking through the marketplace, and she was beautiful. She looked like nobody that Aladdin had ever seen before. And when she was adjusting her headscarf, he saw a huge, ridiculously huge emerald in her hair. He's like, "Oh, okay, a rich girl out in the marketplace, living dangerously, playing hooky." Okay, I'm gonna let my skincare sit in for a few minutes before we move on to makeup. Now, Aladdin knew that other street rats would notice her too, and other street rats were not as discriminating as he was. He only stole to eat. Other street rats did not. And he knew pretty soon she would be relieved of her jewelry or worse. Aladdin's watching her. The girl does something kind of strange. She takes an apple from a street vendor and just gives it to a hungry little kid and then just walks away. And the street merchant notices her and he's like, "Hey," and he like grabs her and he's like, "How are you gonna pay for that?" And she's like, "Pay?" Like she had no concept of the idea. So the merchant grabs her and he throws her against the stall. He grabs his sword and he raises it above her wrist. And she's like, "No, no, please." She's like, "If you let me go, I can go to the palace and get some money from the Sultan." But Aladdin was on it. He jumped in between them. He grabbed the sword from the merchant just before it came down. And he's like, "Oh, thank you, kind sir." And the merchant's like, "You know this girl?" And Aladdin's like, "Sadly, yes, she's my sister. She's a little crazy." And then he turns to the girl and he's like, "I've been looking all over for you." The girl was confused and she's just like, "What are you doing?" And he's like, "Just play along." And the merchant was like, "She was stealing from my cart and she said she knew the Sultan." Because, I mean, he kind of bought that. She looked like someone who might know the Sultan. And Aladdin's like, "She thinks the monkey is the Sultan." And the girl kind of catches on to what he's doing and she starts bowing before the monkey and she's like, "Oh, wise Sultan, how may I serve you?" And Aladdin's like, "Tragic, isn't it? But no harm." And he gets an apple that he had lifted from a different cart to give back to this vendor. He's like, "Come on, sis, time to see Auntie Adina now." And she's like, "Okay." She makes some like crazy goofy eyes and she stops in front of a camel. She goes, "Oh, hi, Auntie Adina." And Aladdin's like, "No, no, that's not Auntie." And they go running off with Abu. Now, I was confused by this. Why did they change doctor to Aunt Adina? Like in the movie, they say, "Come on, we're gonna go see the doctor now." And she's like, "Oh, hi, doctor." And he's like, "No, no, no, not that one." But yeah, for some reason, they took the doctor out and put in an auntie. There's something not PC about seeing a doctor for your mental health. I don't know. Now, far beneath the rooms of the palace was a deep and dark workshop. Jafar was in there. He was the Sultan's Grand Vizier and closest advisor and closest friend since the Sultana had died. Now, people gossiped that he meddled in dark magic and that his cobra head staff that he carried everywhere gave him control over people. And most people felt that the Sultan was so completely under Jafar's control that there was nothing out of reach for Jafar. It was also said that Jafar could make people disappear into the dungeons and never be seen again. Now, in this workshop, there was terrible equipment, and one machine in particular was made of black metal and was all spiky and twisted into unsettling shapes. And in all its gears was a bunch of stuff like cloth or spider silk or bloody red feathers. Now, above this machine, the air started to ripple and reveal a visual scene. Now, this magic that he was practicing was the most forbidden, most esoteric magic known to people in the know. You will have to forgive my pronunciation of some of these Arabic words that are coming up. I'm going to do my best, but don't, like everybody else, I have an accent. I'm going to do my best though. So this magic that he was practicing was called Rizar Hadanuk, or the Seeing Beyond. Just then, Razul, the head of the guards, he comes into the workshop and he's like, "Oh, you summoned me." And Jafar is like, "Yes." He gestures to this magical scene in the air and he's like, "I want you to find this boy and bring him in." And Razul, who's familiar with the marketplace and the people in it, he's like, "Oh, I know that guy. He's just a boy. He's just a street rat, a petty thief. I mean, what harm could he possibly do to the Sultan?" And Jafar was like, "It's important to the Sultan that he come in." Jafar told him that he had foreseen that he was going to be involved in some events that could impact Agrabah, and that he needed to bring him in immediately. And Razul was like, "Oh yes, of course." He's like, "I'll do it at once." And as he's turning to leave, he's like, "Where's Iago? He's usually always sitting on your shoulder." And Jafar's like, "What?" He's like, oh, he's probably off somewhere eating crackers, I assume." And then Razul was like, "Oh, okay." And he scurried out of there because he did not like to be in there for longer than he had to be. So he leaves, and then Jafar, still looking at the image of this boy, he's like, "So this is my diamond in the rough." Now, back with Aladdin and the girl, he had asked her if he could take her home, make sure she got there safely, but she just shook her head no. So he decided to take her to his place. Presumptuous. Now, on their way, he gave her a tour of the street rat quarters. And he was explaining to her why things were the way they were, like why you had to pay for things, and how some people couldn't. And it all kind of seemed like this was new information to her. But she did seem smart and she caught on fast. Then she thanked him for saving her from that man back there. And he said, "Oh, no problem." He's like, "You looked like you needed some help, like it was your first time in the marketplace." And she's like, "Oh, was I that obvious?" And he's like, "Well, you do sort of stand out." And then he realized what he said, and he's like, "Oh, well, you don't seem to understand how dangerous Agrabah can be." And he grabbed a pole and he pole vaulted from the roof that they were standing on to the next one over. And then he finds a long plywood board thing to lay across from one roof to the other for her to walk across. But before he could finish laying it out, she had grabbed a pole vaulted over to where he was. And she was like, "Yeah, I know, but I'm kind of a fast learner." Aladdin's thinking to himself, he's like, what kind of rich girl is this? One who can pole vault like a mountain goat and play crazy at the last second. One who had never seen poverty, and now that she was being confronted with it, actually thought about it rather than being, making rash statements and assumptions. And she didn't care that Aladdin was a thief. He's like, come on. And he holds out his hand to her as they enter into a tower. And he tells her to watch her head as they're coming into his landing. And she's like, you live here? Like, she's really impressed. And he's like, yep, just me and Abu. We come and go as we please. And she's like, that sounds wonderful. And he tells her, well, it's not much, but it's got a great view. And he pulls back a curtain, revealing a very impressive view of the palace. Now, the girl didn't have the reaction he had been hoping for. And Aladdin was like, oh, the palace looks pretty amazing, doesn't it? And she's like, oh, yeah, it's wonderful. She said it kind of like sadly. And he was like, I wonder what it'd be like to live there, to have servants and valets. And she's like, oh, sure, people to tell you where to go and how to dress. She kind of rolled her eyes. And Aladdin's like, well, it's better than here. Just scraping by, always ducking the guards. And he's like, it's like you're... And Jasmine finished his sentence. She was like, trapped. And he was like, yeah, it was like she really understood where he was coming from. So Aladdin finally gets the courage to ask her where she's from anyway. And she's like, oh, it doesn't matter. I ran away and I'm not going back. He's like, really? You ran away? How come? And she said it was because her father was forcing her to get married. And Aladdin's like, oh, that's not fair. He's like, I wish there was something I could do to help. And she was like, oh, that's very sweet. And then they lean towards each other for a kiss. But of course, right then is when the guards show up and they're like, found you. And they both jump up and they're like, they're after me. And they look at each other and they're like, they're after you? So Aladdin jumps up onto the windowsill and he looks at her and he puts his hand out and he's like, do you trust me? And she's like, yeah. He goes, then jump. And they jump. He grabs her, pulls her towards him, and they like fall like several stories into a big pile of soft sand. And they get up holding hands and they go to run off, but then they run right into Razul's chest. And Razul's like, we just keep running into each other, don't we, street rat? Razul's like, it's the dungeon for you this time, boy. The girl runs up to Razul and uselessly starts hitting him on the chest with her tiny little fists. She's like, let him go. And Razul just like tosses her aside. He's like, oh, look at this, a street mouse. And they all start laughing. But she gets up and she says, unhand him. And she takes her hood off and she's like, by order of the princess. And everybody stopped laughing. Aladdin was shocked. He was like, the girl, he's thinking, the girl I just spent the entire afternoon with, the girl I just almost kissed, is the royal princess Jasmine? And Razul's like, Princess Jasmine. He's like, what are you doing outside of the palace and with this street rat? And the princess is like, that's not your concern. She's like, do as I command, release him. And Razul's like, well, I would. And he did seem genuine about it. Maybe, he thought all this was a bit much over a loaf of bread as well. But he's like, my orders come from Jafar, so you'll have to take it up with him. Jasmine's like, oh, believe me, I will. Now, Aladdin was thrown into the deepest, darkest dungeon. And he had been there for a few hours, chained up. And he was muttering to himself. He's like, oh, I can't believe she was the princess. I must have sounded so stupid to her. But then he thought of her eyes and he's like, yeah, but she was worth it. Then Aladdin thought he heard the chittering of a little monkey, and he looks up and he sees him in the barred window. He's like, oh, Abu. He's like, oh, am I glad to see you? So Abu jumps down and Aladdin is able to finger out in his chains, finger inside of Abu's little vest where there was a pin that he had stuck in there just for such the occasion. And he's able to kind of maneuver himself, and he uses the pen to undo the lock on his manacles. Now, this I thought was, I guess, the book's way of explaining how, you know, Abu was able to pick the lock. You know, when you're reading a story with magic and genies, it's not much of a stretch to assume you could train a monkey to pick a lock. But I guess that wasn't real. But anyway, he was free now. And so he goes to Abu. He's like, okay, well, let's try and find a way out of here. He's like, I'm probably never going to see her again anyway. She's a princess and she has to marry a prince. So I was a fool. Then he heard a creepy voice come out of the shadows. And it said, you're only a fool if you give up, boy. Aladdin turns around and he sees this creepy old man hobbling out of the shadows. He's like, who are you? And the old man's like, I'm just a lowly prisoner like yourself, but together perhaps we could be more. And Aladdin's like, I'm listening. The old man says, there is a cave of wonders, boy. And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out a fistful of rubies, I guess as proof that this cave exists. And he shows it to Aladdin, and Aladdin's like, dang. He's like, just those few rubies could have bought all of the property in the quarter of the street rats and the people probably. Anyway, the old man, he's like, there's enough treasure in this cave to impress even your princess, I would wager. But she has to marry a prince, remember? He's telling the old man this. He's like, it's the rules. And the old man's like, well, you've heard of the golden rule, haven't you? Those who have the gold make the rules. And he's laughing, and he reveals his only healthy tooth is like a fake gold one. Anyway, so Aladdin's thinking about what he said just then. He's like, you know, all the guards in the marketplace, they could be bribed. You know, maybe except for Razul probably. So he's thinking, well, then maybe kings and sultans can be bribed as well. And Aladdin's like, well, why would you share all of this wonderful treasure with me? And the old man's like, I need a young pair of legs and a strong back to go in after it. And Aladdin's like, okay, except there's still one problem. It's out there and we're in here. And the man's like, things aren't always what they seem. And he puts the end of his cane on a stone in the wall, and it slides aside. He's like, things aren't always what they seem. He's like, so, do we have a deal? And Aladdin thought about it, and he was like, yeah. So Aladdin follows the old man through subterranean passageways. Aladdin knows they're under the castle somewhere. He follows them, and the passageway comes out on the outside of the palace walls to where the royal stables are. And they steal a couple of horses and they go running out into the desert. So they rode for a very long time, and the trip was not easy. But finally they get to a little valley, and the old man reaches inside of his pocket and he pulls something out and he's cupping it like it's alive or something. Now, Aladdin got a glimpse of whatever he was holding, and it looked like a very expensive piece of jewelry that was shaped like a beetle. And all of a sudden it starts to glow and spark, and it flies off into the valley. Then it circled a large mound of sand and plunged deep into it. All the dunes started rippling and something was rising to the surface, and a giant stone head of a tiger emerged. Its eyes glowed, and it said, "Who disturbs my slumber?" in the voice of an ancient god. So Aladdin looks up at the tiger head and he's like, "It is I, Aladdin." And the tiger replies, "Proceed, but touch nothing but the lamp." And Aladdin, he looks back at the old man for some reassurance, I guess. And the old man's like, he's like, "Remember, bring me the lamp and you'll receive your reward." So Aladdin looks at Abu and he's like, "Come on." And they enter the cave. Now, this part, everything that happens in the cave is exactly what happens in the movie. They go into the cave, they meet the magic carpet, Aladdin finds the lamp, but Abu touches the treasure. So all of a sudden there's a great earthquake and the cave starts collapsing on them. So they ride the magic carpet to the edge of the cave where the old man is standing. And they're like hanging on to the edge for dear life, trying to get the old man to help them up. And the old man is very insistent that they first give him the lamp, then he'll help them up. So Aladdin reaches into his vest, he hands them the lamp, and he expects the old man to help them up. But instead, he pulls out a dagger. And Aladdin's like, "What are you doing?" And the old man's like, "I'm giving you your reward, your eternal reward." But right then, before he can stab them, the cave completely closes, trapping Aladdin and Abu inside. Now this is where the twist comes in. In the movie, Abu had lifted the lamp off of the old man before they got trapped in the cave. But in this story, he didn't. So Aladdin was alive and so was Abu, but they were trapped in this cave hundreds of feet below the surface with no way out, no treasure, and no lamp. Now back at the palace, Jasmine was searching the jails and dungeons for Aladdin, but she couldn't find him. So then she started searching for Jafar to ask him where Aladdin was, but then she couldn't find him. So then she goes to her father. She went to his study where all his toys were, and he sees her and he's happy to see her, and he's like, "Oh, Jasmine." But then he notices she's got an upset look on her face. He asked her, he's like, "Is everything all right?" And she told him everything that happened the day before in the marketplace with the boy. And the Sultan told his daughter that he would discuss it with Jafar immediately. And right then Jafar comes into the room and Jafar's like, "Discuss what with me, Your Majesty?" Jasmine immediately goes up to him and she's like, "What did you do with the boy from the marketplace?" And Jafar's like, "Oh, I'm sure he's probably dead by now." And Jasmine's like, "Dead?" And he's like, "Yes, dead, executed. He was taken out into the desert and executed for laying hands on the princess." And Jasmine's like, "How could you?" And the Sultan's like, "Who gave you permission to conduct an execution?" And Jafar, he's like, "Silence, old man. I didn't come here to discuss the fate of one street rat with you." Now, Jasmine and her father were speechless. No one talked to the Sultan like that, not even Jafar. And Jafar says, he's like, "I've come to tell you that I'm afraid your reign has come to an end." And the Sultan's like, "Explain yourself." Now, Jasmine, she was still in shock about finding out that the boy had died, but she could tell something strange was afoot, so she like forced herself to pay attention to what was going on. Anyway, Jafar's like, "Well, with pleasure." And he reaches into his cape and he pulls out an old busted up lamp, and he rubs the lamp with his sleeve, and then a tiny wisp of blue smoke started to come out of this spout. Now something streaky and blue started racing around the room, and it expanded, and the sound of like a human scream filled the room. The blue took the form of a person, kind of a person, like a half person. A big blue half person with smoke on the bottom half. And this big blue person is like, 10,000 years I have spent in that lamp. And Jafar, he's like, "Genie, Genie." But the genie was ignoring him. He was like, "It is good to get out of there." And then Jafar's like, "Genie, Genie." He's like, "I'm your master." He's like, "Heed my words." And the genie's like, "Oh, here's a man who knows what he wants." He's like, "Okay." He's like, "Lay it on me, master." And Jafar's like, Now, you're a genie and you have to grant me three wishes, right? And the genie's like, yep. The genie said that there were a few rules though, and he started to go into them, but Jafar interrupted him and he's like, my first wish is to be the Sultan. And the genie's like, okay, you got it. And the room grew dim and a strange energy filled the room. The Sultan's turban started to rise up into the air. And the Sultan's like, Godfounded, what is this trickery? And he's like, Jafar, you stop this nonsense at once. He obviously wasn't catching on that he couldn't really order Jafar around. I mean, like, he had been the Sultan for so long, he couldn't even fathom the idea that somebody might not listen to him. And Jafar's like, yes, Sultan, but there is a new order now. He's like, my order. He's like, bow to me. And the Sultan was like, never. So Jafar's, he's like, well, if you won't bow before a Sultan, perhaps you'll cower before a sorcerer. He's like, Genie, my second wish is to be the most powerful sorcerer in the world. Now you could tell by the expression on the genie's face, even he thought this was a bad idea. But what could he do? He points his finger at Jafar and a bunch of lightning comes out of his finger. And all of a sudden, Jafar's like stately sultan clothes turn black and his turban becomes like strange and angular. And he's like, and now, abject humiliation. And he points his staff at Jasmine and her father, and they're forced into positions of supplication at Jafar's feet. And then Jafar says, okay, Genie, time for my last wish. He's like, I wish for Jasmine to fall madly in love with me. And everyone was shocked into silence, and Jasmine felt like she was gonna throw up a little bit. But the genie was like, well, you know, before Mr. High and Mighty Sorcerer of the World interrupted me, I was going to tell you that there are some limitations to your wishes. He's like, here's the basic laws of magic, kids. He's like, listen up. The rules were he couldn't kill anybody, he couldn't bring anybody back from the dead, and he couldn't make anyone fall in love with anybody else. And Jasmine was like, whew, huge relief. But Jafar was like, well, what's good is a genie that has limitations? Jafar throws his cape aside and he magically puts some shackles onto Jasmine's wrists and her father's. And then he forces them to walk behind him in a compelled march. And then the genie is behind them. Now, while they're walking out to the balcony, the genie leans over to Jasmine. He's like, sorry about all this. And Jasmine's like, well, at least I won't be forced to marry him. And the genie is like, he's like, no. He's like, how about we don't give any ideas to Mr. Revengey Pants over here. He's like, there is a substantial difference legally and magically between being forced to marry and being forced to love. And Jasmine was like, oh yeah, he's got a point. And she just kind of shut up from then on. So the four of them, they continue their march out to the public balcony. And Jafar throws open the curtains and they go out there and all the people are starting to gather for a royal announcement. So Jafar, he raises his staff in the air and he waits for everyone to gather around. And he's like, people of Agrabah. His words are echoing off of the buildings, making it sound bigger. He's like, at long last, the suffering you have endured at the hands of this sultan is over. With the support of the palace guards and Princess Jasmine, I, Jafar, am the new sultan of Agrabah. And he was expecting to hear some cheers, but he was disappointed. He was like, I will be a sultan of the people, attentive to your every need. And as my first act as sultan, I want to show you my good faith. And then all of a sudden, a bunch of golden coins started raining from the heavens. And people started diving to get the money and putting their hands up in the air, and they were rejoicing. And when the initial rush for all the money was over, everyone started cheering, "Long live Jafar." And then Jafar, he turns to the other three and he puts his hand on the Sultan's chest and he's like, "You see?" He's like, "Now that is real power." And he pushes the Sultan over the balcony. Now, meanwhile, out in the desert, Aladdin was digging himself out of the Cave of Wonders. It took him 2 or 3 days, but he finally popped his head through the sand. And then he him and Abu, rode the magic carpet until they got to a well that was right outside the city walls. So he drank his fill of water, but then he noticed things were very quiet. Usually there were caravans coming and going, watering their camels, travelers. Agrabah was a pretty bustling city, but there was nobody around. So he had the magic carpet kind of roll up and he put him on his shoulder, like over his shoulder right here. And then Abu was on his other shoulder. And they go walking into the city through the city walls. And still there was nobody around. I'm going to be using a very appropriate palette. So as they were walking through the city, Aladdin was grabbing little bits of food here and there. It had been about 3 days since he'd eaten anything. And still the streets are empty, so that made it easy. And he had almost made it to the center of the city before he started seeing any signs of life. He started seeing people running to the city square. So he grabs one of these people and he's like, "What's going on?" And the guy's like, "Oh, you haven't heard?" He's like, "There's gonna be a grand parade for the new sultan." And Aladdin's like, "New sultan?" Aladdin was like, "What happened? Why is there a new sultan?" And the man's like, "The old one is gone." And he says, "Long live Jafar." And he like pumps his fist in the air, almost like a military salute. And then the man goes running off. And Aladdin immediately is concerned about Jasmine. Is she okay? So he decided to go to the parade to do some further investigating. And when he gets there, the street is lined on both sides with tons of people waiting for this parade to start. So the parade begins to march down the street, and the whole scene is very similar to the Prince Ali parade that happens in the movie. There's dancers and sword eaters and fire breathers and animals and elephants. Now on top of one of these elephants was the Grand Vizier Jafar. And he was waving and smiling. And every once in a while he'd give an extra little flourish with his hand. And whenever he did that, gold coins and bread would rain from the sky. And the people would go running and falling over themselves to gather up this money and bread. Now everyone had known, including Aladdin, that Jafar had, meddled in the dark arts, but he had never displayed powers like this before. Then Aladdin noticed a creature behind him. It was a genie, like from fairy tales. He also noticed that Jafar was clutching a brass lamp, the very one that Aladdin had gone into the cave for. So Aladdin starts putting all this together. Jafar was the old man, and Jafar had had him arrested under false pretenses just to get him to go into the cave to get the lamp. And of course, Aladdin starts to wonder if Jasmine is okay again. Was she a prisoner? Did she run away? Aladdin, he needed to go somewhere and rest and think and regroup. But he was reluctant to go back to his place since it was, compromised. So he decided to go pay a visit to some old friends. Now, after the parade, back at the palace, Jasmine was in her room, depressed, naturally. Jafar comes in and he tells her that, while he can't make her fall in love with him, he can make her marry him as a way for him to solidify his position to the throne. He also tells her that he has been studying his magic, and he's trying to figure out a way to break the laws of magic so that one day she will love him. After he leaves, she starts crying, of course. This is devastating news. But then she starts realizing, she's like, you know what? No more crying. She is a royal princess, and she needs to start acting like one. No more talk of being trapped or being handed over from one man to another. It was time to start acting. She needed to start being the hero in her own story. Now back to Aladdin. He was in the most dangerous part of the city, and he was looking for his old hideout that he used to have with Morgiana and Dubin. So he had to dodge a few booby traps and go through some secret passageways, but he finally got to the cave where they all lived. And their little gang of thieves had grown quite a bit since he had last been there. Aladdin asked them what had happened to the city since he had been preoccupied. And they laughed and they were like, yeah, we'd all like to know. It seemed creepy old Grand Vizier Jafar was now creepy Sultan Jafar. His friends told them that, you know, having Jafar as the Sultan was actually kind of okay. The regime change had been peaceful. There was no military uprising, and nobody had gone hungry. Nobody had to steal foods because of all the handouts. And crime in the city was down because of the new peacekeeping patrols. But despite of all this, Aladdin's friends, they were pretty suspicious. History has shown time and time again, it is generally unwise to rely on others, especially those in charge, to provide for the poor. Eventually, they would stop, or at least want something in return. Now, none of the citizens, his friends are still telling him all this, seemed to really care that the old sultan had been killed. Aladdin, this being news to him, he was like, killed? He's like, what about Princess Jasmine? Is she okay? And they were like, well, she's gonna be marrying Jafar as a way for Jafar to solidify his position on the throne. And Aladdin was very upset by this. He was like, oh, we have to stop the wedding. And his friends are like, are you nuts? And Morgiana's like, what, have you suddenly decided to defend women's rights? Or is there something you're not telling us? And all Aladdin would reply was, it's a long story. So the following night, Aladdin, Abu, and the magic carpet, they snuck in to rescue Princess Jasmine. They used the tunnels that Jafar had taken Aladdin through to get to the Cave of Wonders to get inside. And everything went pretty smoothly getting in. Getting out was not as smooth. The magic carpet got captured, and then Aladdin accidentally tipped over a large marble pillar right on top of Rasul, killing him. But him, Jasmine, and Abu did get away. So Aladdin takes Jasmine back to Morgiana's and Dubin's hideout. And on the way, he explains to her what had happened to him, that, you know, he had been the one that got the lamp for Jafar. When they got back to the hideout, everyone, of course, was very surprised to see the princess. And after introductions, Aladdin noticed that all the thieves seemed a little on edge and nervous. And he's like, what's going on? He's like, is it the peacekeeping patrols? And they all explained that, you know, while most people actually liked the peacekeeping patrols that made them feel safe, they all questioned their tactics. Apparently, just recently, a thief had been killed and tacked to one of the city walls, a dagger in each hand and each foot. Also, there was the little problem with inflation. And Jasmine's like, inflation? She's like, you mean like money? She's like, what does that have to do with anything? Morgiana tries to explain. She holds up an orange and she's like, a week ago, you could buy a bag of these oranges for 1 silver shekel. Now, it costs you 20 just for one. When you can bring forth money from the sky, it's, you know, basically worthless. Sound familiar? Aladdin wondered, he's like, I wonder if that's what the Cave of Wonders is. Maybe it wasn't just, you know, the tomb of some crazy old rich sultan that wanted to bring his treasure to the land beyond or whatever. Maybe someone had almost destroyed the world, bringing too much gold into it. Then Jasmine told everyone about the genie, how Jafar had wished himself into power. She also told them that he was working on breaking the laws of magic so that he could raise an army of the dead and conquer the rest of the world. This was, of course, shocking to everyone. Then Jasmine asked Morgiana and Dubin if their network of thieves would help her defeat Jafar. She's like, will you help me stop Jafar from getting the things that he needs to accomplish this nightmare? Will you help me overthrow him and reinstate me on the throne? And they answered yes. And Morgiana's like, okay, princess, you've got yourself a street rat army. What's the plan? Now, Jasmine knew that a very heavily guarded delivery was going to be arriving at the palace soon. She knew that Jafar was very concerned about this delivery, which meant there must be something in there that was very important to him. Like maybe something that would help him accomplish breaking these laws of magic. So the thieves all got together and they ambushed this delivery wagon and they stole all its contents. Now, among the contents, there was the normal stuff like rope and food and stuff, but there was also 5 books. Now, while Morgiana and Aladdin were, casually making their way back to the hideout after this heist, they see like a group of people like rushing to get into a line. And Morgiana and Aladdin, they, go up to someone in the line. They're like, what's this line for? And the guy's like, oh, he's like, Jafar, he's giving out bread. He's like, you better get in line fast before it's all gone. And Aladdin's like, I thought he just gave it away, like tossed it from the palace balcony and stuff. And the man's like, not anymore. Now, up at the front of the line was a tent. And under the tent was a table. And there was a man sitting at the table. And there were 2 guards on either side of him. And behind them was a bunch of bread. And there was a woman standing opposite the man at the table. He asked her, do you swear your entire allegiance to Jafar's new Agrabah ascendant? And the woman's like, yes, of course. And the man asks, do you swear to uphold his laws and revere him and love him? And she says, I do. And the man's like, excellent. Next, the guard hands the woman 2 loaves of bread. Now, Aladdin and Morgiana, they did not like the look of this. When they got far enough away from the bread line, Morgiana turns to Aladdin and she's like, that was kind of creepy. And Aladdin's like, yeah, I know. He's like, that woman would have sworn away her own mother and not meant it for some food. And Morgiana's like, yeah, and what happens when Jafar realizes that? Now, when they got back to the hideout, Raja was there. And of course, Jasmine was very happy to see him. And he had a ribbon around his neck with a note attached to it. And the note was from the genie. And it told them to keep an eye out for a book in these deliveries that Jafar was having come to the palace, that there was a book in one of them called the Al-Azif by Abdul al-Hazret. Jasmine, having been somewhat educated, being, you know, a princess and all, knew about this book. And she told Aladdin that this was some sort of record that some ancient madman, he had recorded some of his travels to some like dark underworlds and realms beyond the universe, and the things that he had learned while he was there. Now somehow the very act of recording these things became a conduct for the power, and just possessing this book would give you the power to kill people with your mind and to raise an army of the dead. Now I actually looked this up, and I'm probably gonna get this wrong. So if anybody else knows about this, please correct me, because I want to know. I don't know why stuff like this like really intrigues me. But so I looked up this book, and if I understand correctly, the Al-Azif technically is a real book, or it's thought to be a real book, and it's part of the Necronomicon, which is not a real book. The Necronomicon is a fictional book made up of a bunch of different books of the dead from all over the world, including this book. Now, obviously, there's no actual Al-Azif book out there. From what I can understand, they have possibly found bits and pieces of this supposed book. But anyway, some people think it's real, some people don't. So, since I believe in magic and fairy tales, I'm gonna believe that it is real, though it may not exist anymore. Now somehow, I'm not exactly sure how, a secret meeting was arranged between Jasmine and the Genie. They met at some tea house in an upscale neighborhood somewhere. Anyhow, at this meeting, the Genie tells Jasmine that he knows of a secret delivery that's going to be coming from Carcosa in the next 3 days. And it was going to have a lot of books in it. So the Genie felt that this was going to be the big one. This was going to be the delivery with the Al-Azif. One day, Aladdin and Dubin are coming from another heist. They had stolen a wagon full of food that was going to the palace, and a man approaches them. And this man, he's dressed very nicely. They could tell he probably, you know, was of some wealth. The man introduces himself, and he says that his name is Amir, and that he is the head of the Jewelers Guild. And he says that he would like to speak with the leader of the street rats. So Aladdin and Dubin, after asking a lot of questions and making sure this was okay, they took him to Jasmine. So Amir tells Jasmine that he wants to discuss their cause with them. And Morgiana speaks up, and she's like, "Our cause?" He's like, "What do you care? Jafar isn't bothering you. He's not making you and other rich people take an oath of loyalty for a loaf of bread. When curfew tolls, you go up into your mansions and have a grand old time just waiting for the next morning." She's like, "How is he bothering you?" And Amir is like, he's like, you know, life's not that simple. He's like, let's start with, you know, this influx of gold first of all. I'm sure as a thief, you know how much this is devaluing the worth of our money. So Jafar was ruining their trade. And a second thing, Amir goes on, he's like, Jafar has closed all of the schools and religious education centers. And Dubin's like, why would he do that? And Jasmine, being a smart lady, she knew. She's like, anyone who's educated knows where Jafar's benevolent rule ends. And the jeweler, he's like, yeah, it's true. He's like, everyone is dissatisfied with Jafar's rule. He's like, I'm here to represent a certain segment of the population, the guilds, the religious leaders, people that, typically you probably wouldn't have had discourse with. But we've heard of your little band and your raids, and we want to do whatever we can to support you. But of course, Morgiana is still suspicious. But he goes on, he's like, you aren't the only ones that value freedom. The freedom to do what you want, when you want, with whom you want. The freedom to read what you want, very important. To be able to take your granddaughters for a walk at sunset. He's like, it seems like a little thing to not do, but it matters. Even mansion walls can't keep the fear of the peace patrols out. And Morgiana's like, okay, so you want us to do the dirty work and you'll support it? She's like, suddenly you care about the freedom that's been denied the poorest people in the city all of a sudden? She's like, where were you before the bread lines when people were just hungry? And Amir had an answer. He sounds like a kind of a smart guy. He's like, it's kind of hard to gauge the severity of a situation when doing so puts you in danger. If you come to certain parts of the city, you could be robbed or worse. Princess Jasmine could sense the argument that was stirring. So she's like, okay, she's like, how about we just agree that once this is all over, we will all work on these problems together. Agrabah's problems are everyone's problem. And Amir and Morgiana, they agreed to this. So Jasmine's like, great. She's like, now I need to get out there and start distributing bread to those families that have refused this, swearing allegiance thing. Now, as they were out and about doing this, Jasmine and the other leaders of the resistance, they decided that, they needed to start doing more, that there wasn't time to wait for everyone's hearts in Agrabah to join them. They needed to attack Jafar directly and take back Agrabah. So the night came for them to rob the caravan that was carrying the big one, according to the Genie. They were able to ambush the guards and take the goods. But when they got the wagon to a safe place where they could unload it, they found it was full of rocks.
Rocks?
It was a trap. And right as Aladdin was realizing this, coming from all around was Jafar's booming voice. He's like, did you really think your treacheries would go unnoticed by me? I've learned about the location of your headquarters, and my delivery from Carcosa has already gotten here. I already possess the Al-Azif. Now, Dubin was very concerned about Jafar having found their headquarters because his elderly father, his niece, and his nephew were there. So they needed to get back right away. So they all start running back to the hideout, but Jafar's voice follows them. He's like, people of Agrabah, behold, those that would make life hard for you. They scurry like the very rats that they call themselves into the filthy and diseased parts of the city. He says, if you would see an Agrabah at peace and prosperous, I implore you to turn in these villainous wretches that would tear it apart. When they finally get back to the hideout, it's in shambles. They didn't know if someone from Jafar's camp had been there and destroyed it, or if the street rats had destroyed it because they didn't want their plans to be seen. So they destroyed it before they could get out. They didn't really know. The place was abandoned, And Jafar's voice continues to address the people of Agrabah. He says that, I'm afraid that, until we've quilled this terrorist group, we're just going to have to keep a closer eye on everyone. I've tried the carrot and now it's time for the stick. And just in case you were wondering just how serious I am about your safety, come by the palace gates and see what happens to street rat sympathizers. So the four of them, they knew they needed to get out of their headquarters since it was now compromised. So they go running outside. When they get outside, they look up and there's a bunch of flying guards. And they're led by Razul. But Razul was dead. His eyes were red and his skin was super pale. And his arms and legs just kind of hung there. And Morgiana's like, he's risen from the dead. And then more and more squadrons start forming over the city. And Jafar continues his announcement. He says, I have now completely broken one of the laws of magic, and I am able to bring back people from the dead permanently and under my control. He says that every time someone from their side falls, he's risen and adds to his numbers. He says, death is my friend in the war for Agrabah. And then he's like, Jasmine, even if you manage to avoid my armies, I would still advise that you turn yourself in by dawn tomorrow. Then a great swirling cone of sand goes rising up into the air, and it forms into a scene of an old man, a little girl, and a little boy, and they're trapped inside of an hourglass, and the sand is slowly falling on top of them. And they're banging on the glass trying to get out. It's Dubin's family. And just like that, everything cuts off. Jafar's voice and the sand that was in the air falls like rain. And Jasmine's like, if it's a war he wants, then it's a war he gets. So they all go back to Aladdin's old place to come up with a plan. And this is what they come up with. First, they needed a new headquarters. So they were going to use the old bread factory. They knew that Jafar would expect them to attack the castle straight on. So that's what they would do, while a couple of their best thieves snuck in, stole the lamp, the book, rescued Dubin's family, and then they would use the lamp to wish away everything that Jafar had done. They weren't too worried about Jafar using magic to figure out their plans. This same type of magic that he had used to find Aladdin, this was blood magic. And it required the sacrifice of somebody close to Jafar. But who was Jafar close to? And then they realized, the parrot. That's why no one had seen him lately. Now, shortly before the battle, Aladdin and Jasmine found some time alone together, and this is when they confessed their love for one another. Now, when the battle did start, everything went according to plan, mostly. The street rat army attacked the front gates, and this attracted the attention of Jafar and his undead army. Aladdin, Morgiana, and Dubin snuck in to the castle, though this time they did not use the tunnels that Aladdin was aware of. They knew that Jafar would expect that. Now, as the battle raged on, more and more people were being killed. And Jasmine, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to stop the killing. So as soon as she got a moment alone, she snuck out into the night. She made her way through the urban warfare, and she found one of the Imperial Guards. And she walks up to him and she's like, I'm Princess Jasmine. I'm the one that Jafar wants to marry, and I'm turning myself in. So take me to him. They take her to Jafar, who's in the throne room. She says, okay, Jafar, you win. I will consent to marrying you. Let's just end this now. Now, on one side of the throne was the hourglass with Dubin's family trapped inside. On the other side was the genie chained up. And then on a table closest to the throne was the lamp and a book bound in leather with a human eye in the center of it, the Adhesive. Now, Jafar said that if this was going to work, for him to call off his armies, they needed to be married right then and there. And Jasmine agreed. And then she was instantly in a wedding dress, and one of the guards ran off to grab a clergyman. So then they go out onto the balcony, and Jafar, he shouts in his announcement voice that for everyone to stop fighting, that him and Princess Jasmine had come to an agreement that the war was over and that the two of them would be getting married right then. So put down your weapons and come to the palace to bear witness. Now, during the ceremony, Jasmine saw the curtains behind the throne shiver a little. And then Aladdin stuck his head out and gave her a little wink. And she motions ever so slightly with her chin over to the table where the lamp and the book are. And Aladdin, he drops down to the floor and he goes scurrying over there. And right as he's reaching for the lamp, a bunch of vines wrap around his arms and his legs, imprisoning him. And Jafar turns around. He's like, ha! He's like, I was expecting this all along. But he's like, I'll make you a deal, Aladdin. He's like, join me, convince the street rats to give up and give in, and we'll all live happily ever after. And I'll bring your mother back from the dead. But Aladdin's like, never. Right then, Morgiana and Dubin come barreling into the throne room with swords. Dubin cuts the vines from Aladdin's arms and legs, and Morgiana goes running over to the hourglass trying to break it and free Dubin's family. Dubin goes diving for the book, but he's cut off by a wall of fire. Jafar snatches the lamp, puts it in his robe. Furniture and vases and bric-a-brac are starting to fly around the room, trying to smash all of them. And then lightning bolts start shooting from Jafar's fingers, and they all have to kind of jump and hopscotch around to avoid them. Aladdin realizes that they're wasting their time trying to break through Jafar's defenses. They should be attacking his defenses directly, which is his staff. He's not as powerful without it. So Aladdin, he ends up headbutting Jafar and wrenches the staff away from him. But then Jafar uses his other kind of magic, I guess, and Aladdin starts to have trouble breathing. He feels like he's choking. So Aladdin tosses the staff to Jasmine and tells her to break it. So she raises the staff over her head, and then she starts whispering some magical Arabic words that I'm not going to attempt. And Jafar, his eyes widen when he starts realizing what she's saying. And he crumples over in pain, and everything stops. The furniture falls to the ground, and the fire is gone. And Jasmine's like, oh yes, that's right, Jafar. I read some of those books that you stole from all over the world, and I picked up a few things. And I think I'm going to put an end to all of this, and you. And Aladdin comes walking up to Jasmine, and he's like, don't do this. And she's like, what? You want me to just let him go? It's Jafar. He'll escape or magic his way out. She's like, if I kill him, it all ends now. And Aladdin's like, but at what cost? He's like, you said you wanted a new Agrabah for all, a just one, and that includes him. He's like, if you want to execute him, fine, but have a trial first, a public trial, where everyone can see the justice being carried out. She's like, fine. And then she swings the staff into the hourglass, breaking it and freeing Dubin's family. And then she gives Aladdin a look that's like, yeah, you were right. Then all of a sudden, Dubin comes running up and he says, you know, Jasmine may not have had the heart to kill you, but I do. And he's holding the Adhesive. Remember, if you just have it, that you can kill people with your mind. And Dubin's like, you will die the way you would have had my family die. And then Jafar starts like choking and blood starts trickling out of the side of his mouth. Jafar was not done yet. He's like, you fools. He's like, I have one wish left. And Jasmine's like, Jafar, it's over. She's like, whatever you wish for, we'll just undo once we take the lamp. Then Jafar, he clears his throat and the best he can as he's choking. He says, Genie, I wish that when I die, all magic dies with me. As he's dying, he says one last thing to Jasmine. He's like, good luck fixing everything without magic. You need it for happy endings, you know. And then But before anyone could even react to what just happened, they started hearing terrible groans and thunking noises coming out from the hallways. It was the undead. They were returning to their natural state, which was dead. Then they heard a bunch of shouts of confusion and triumph coming from beyond the balcony. Then everyone looked over to where the genie was, but he was gone. And in his place was a man with ordinary flesh and hair. And Jasmine's like, Genie, you're not magical anymore. He's like, oh my gosh, I thought I'd never be free again. I'm a human. Jasmine walks out onto the balcony and addresses the people. She's like, people of Agrabah, you are free. We won. Then the friends emerged from the palace with Jasmine on their shoulders, and they were shouting, make way for Sultana Jasmine. And word got out pretty quickly when people started seeing her, you know, smiling and waving. And then they had a big party at the hideout. And there, Raja and Abu showed up safe and sound. And there were parties in the streets and everyone was celebrating. Now, after a few days of partying, everyone made their way back to the palace. And they saw the Adhesive in a pile of ashes smoldering, so they knew that had been destroyed, so that's good. They found the lamp and they gave it to the genie, who I guess his name was just Genie now. Now Genie had decided that he was going to travel the world, he was going to finally see snow, and Dubin decided he was going to go with him. He was carrying a lot of guilt for the way that he had killed Jafar. Guess, you know, with hindsight, he realized he shouldn't have done that. So he wanted to go with Genie to travel and clear his mind. And he said he would come back when he had made peace with his mistakes. So then Aladdin and Jasmine, they were able to get some time alone together. And they walk out onto the balcony and they're watching the remnants of the fires smoldering and, you know, still smoking. And Jasmine's like, this is gonna take some time to clean up. And Aladdin's like, yeah, you're right, but I think you're up to it. And Jasmine's like, you know, I'm gonna make Agrabah the greatest city in the world, and I'm gonna have the street rats and the guilds and all kinds of members of the community be on my council. And Aladdin's like, what about me? I don't get to be on the council? And she's like, darling, she's like, you're gonna be a little too busy. She's like, as the prince, you're going to have other responsibilities and duties. Ooh. And Aladdin's like, wait, what? And she just leans over and kisses him. The end. This book was so cute. Now, this author, she also wrote the Snow White Twisted Tale, and it has a lot of the same themes. That one also had an uprising against a tyrannical ruler. which I like. But yeah, I really enjoyed this one. It's one of my favorite twisted tails. And yeah, I think that if you are interested in reading this, you totally should. Of course, I have to leave so much out just for the sake of time. These videos are already pretty long usually, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But if you're interested in reading this and getting all the details, there's a link in my description. It's not an affiliate link, it's just there for your convenience. So yeah, I hope you liked this video. If you did, let me know by giving it a thumbs up. It's how I know what kind of videos to make, what I should be spending my time on for you. Make sure and hit the notifications bell so that you don't miss the next twisted tale, Disney book, fairy tale, or whatever book I happen to be reading that week. And remember, don't follow stupid rules. And I will see you in the next one. Bye. And watch me doing my... Now above this machine started to ripple a scene in the air. A scene... I have foreseen that he's going to be involved in I have foreseen that he is going to be involved in some events that could alter the... They had also met the magic carpet. No. So Jafar, he's like, at long last, the suffering that you have endured at this sultan. So as they were walking through the city, after she recorded down, oh my God. I'm sorry, Bob. You want to sit with me? You want to sit with me? No? All right. She doesn't want to sit with us. And Amur, I have major period brain. So the night came for them to... She's like, if I kill him, it all ends now. It sounds like I live on a freeway or something.